Have you ever pondered why a society as a whole might occasionally appear to lose its sense of reality and begin adopting irrational beliefs in large numbers? Collective insanity is a fascinating phenomenon that has confounded historians and intellectuals for ages. Let's start with a comment made by famous psychologist Gustave Le Bon before exploring this subject. The truth never satisfies the people. They like to deify error if it attracts them, rejecting evidence that does not fit their preferences. Anyone can simply become their lord by creating illusions for them. Their victim is always the one who attempts to shatter their delusions. This statement raises the question of how a civilization might descend into insanity. What do you think are the biggest dangers to civilization, if I may ask? You may consider pandemics, wars, or natural disasters. But what if I told you that according to Carl Jung, the human mind itself poses the biggest threat? Jung thought that the biggest threat to civilization was our incapacity to address the inner forces of the psyche. It's a battle with our own nature, he said. The Latin saying homo homini lupus est, which translates to man is a wolf, is probably familiar to you. Jung's ideas are succinctly expressed in this sentence. In the worst periods of history, when the illogical becomes the norm rather than the exception, this wolf nature is particularly apparent. This phenomena was dubbed a psychological plague by Jung. The greatest danger to man is not famine, earthquakes, germs, or cancer, he wrote in Symbolic Life, for the straightforward reason that psychic epidemics, which are far more destructive than the most severe natural disasters, are not adequately protected against. Collective psychosis, what is it? In a nutshell, it's a sort of epidemic of insanity that sends a whole society into delusion and away from reality. History is replete with actual and unsettling instances of this phenomenon, despite the fact that it may seem distant. Consider the witch hunts that occurred in America and Europe between the 15th and 17th centuries. As scapegoats for a panic-stricken community, thousands of people, mostly women, were hunted and put to death for reasons other than genuine crimes. Francis Ha writes in The Devil's Mania that toward the conclusion of the madness there were nearly no women left in several Swiss communities. The tyranny of the 20th century is yet another excellent illustration. Millions of people adopted beliefs that now appear to be clearly harmful and irrational. But at the time, these concepts had the power to sway entire countries. Collective psychosis has disastrous consequences. Jung conducted extensive research on these phenomena and found that as a society devolves into lunacy, its citizens experience a moral and spiritual regression, growing increasingly emotional, illogical, and careless. In a crowd, people do crimes they would never do on their own without regret. Even more terrifying is the fact that a society in collective psychosis is unable to recognize its own lunacy, just as an individual in psychosis is unable to recognize his delusions. Those who live in this state have no outside perspective to understand how serious the issue is. So why does civilization descend into mass psychosis? We must first comprehend the individual's origins of psychosis before we can respond to this question. Although substance abuse or physical trauma can cause insanity, we will concentrate on psychological causes here. The most frequent cause is a surge of unpleasant feelings that sends someone into a panic attack, including fear or worry. Imagine this terror spreading like a virus to the entire population. We frantically look for respite when we are in a panic. While some choose to flee by having a mental breakdown, others choose to face the cause of their fear. A psychotic breakdown, in contrast to what is commonly believed, is a restructuring of an individual's experiential world, rather than merely a decline into disorder. Although it is not an adaptive coping technique, it helps to reduce panic by fusing reality and delusion, fact and fantasy. One of the primary authorities on schizophrenia in the 20th century, Silvana Orietti, outlined the psychogenic phases that culminate in insanity. The first is the panic phase, during which the individual starts to see things in a strange light. He is terrified, perplexed, and unable to articulate the bizarre occurrences he is witnessing. Orietti refers to this as the psychotic insight phase. The individual starts to arrange his senses at this period, developing a pathological perspective on reality that enables him to make sense of his strange experiences. Arendt refers to this realization as insight, as the patient at last gives his experiences purpose, yet it is psychotic since it is predicated on illusions rather than a practical comprehension of the circumstances. Essentially, a person in a panic attack might escape the deluge of bad feelings by developing delusions, but doing so comes at the expense of losing touch with reality. According to Arendt, a psychotic episode can be viewed as an aberrant coping mechanism for a severe anxiety attack. Consider this now at the level of a whole society. A collective psychosis can happen when a group of weak people are frightened into panic by actual, imagined, or made-up threats, just as a flood of negative emotions can cause a psychotic collapse in a vulnerable individual. Here's the intriguing part, though. Insanity can appear in a variety of ways, and delusions can take many different forms. The historical and cultural background of the impacted society will determine the specific shape that collective insanity takes. Totalitarianism is currently one of the most dangerous types of collective psychosis. Totalitarianism is the contemporary phenomenon of centralized state power that leads to the elimination of individual human rights, according to historian Arendt and Vaclav. Society is split into two parts under totalitarian regimes, the ruling class and the subordinate class. Both experience pathogenic alterations. In stark contrast to our flawed nature, which is vulnerable to power corruption, the rulers are given an almost supernatural position. However, the masses adopt a regressive and infantile psychological position as a result of becoming dependent on these unhealthy rulers. This is an attempt to alter human nature itself, according to Hannah Arendt, one of the most prominent scholars of totalitarianism in the 20th century. But a utopia is not produced by this change. It turns sound minds into diseased ones. Delusions serve as the foundation for and support the social transformation that takes place under dictatorship. In his book, The Rape of the Mind, psychiatrist Joost Meerlo explains that menticide, or mind murder, is a crucial component of totalitarianism's success. According to Meerlo, menticide is a systematic method of psychological manipulation that obliterates people's capacity for autonomous thought. Through this structure, the ruling elite may instill their opportunistic ideas in the brains of people they intend to exploit and destroy. He clarified that this tactic entails using misinformation and terror in tandem to control the populace. Let's examine the progression of this menticide procedure. It starts by instilling fear by causing panic in the populace, which primes people to believe falsehoods. The usage of dread waves is one method that works quite well. This approach alternates between times of peace and periods of great fear-mongering, but each calm is followed by even more intense fear, and so on. According to Meerlo, because people are still troubled by past experiences, it is easier to create the psychological effects of each wave of panic following a time of quiet. As morality deteriorates further, each new propaganda campaign's psychological impacts intensify, impacting an already vulnerable public. Propaganda is essential to this process because fear primes the populace for mental murder. To enable the masses' minds be destroyed, propaganda is employed to disseminate false information and confuse people regarding the nature of the issue and the sources of threats. People are unable to think rationally due to conflicting reports and purposefully confusing information. This strategy works well because, as Meerlo noted, logic can refute illogic, but illogic perplexes those who are attempting to think rationally. In addition to immobilizing the logical intellect, this intentional misunderstanding makes the populace more reliant on leaders who assert that they know everything. To put it another way, confusion makes people more likely to fall victim to the delusion of dictatorship. Logic and reason are not as emotionally appealing as great lies and the repetitive recitation of absurdities. In our contemporary environment, totalitarians may already start hitting people with a new falsehood, while they are still looking for a plausible defense of the prior one. There has never been a more successful strategy for driving society toward tyranny. Digital technologies, social media, and algorithms make it possible for fear and propaganda to spread quickly throughout the world. People's vulnerability is further increased by their reliance on these technology and the absence of time for introspection and discussion. By saying that modern technology encourages man to accept the world as it is, with no time for privacy and contemplation, Merleau aptly summed up the perils of this modernity. He is drawn to technology because it keeps him moving all the time, without any time for relaxation, meditation, introspection, or discussion, and it exposes him to an overwhelming amount of stimulus. Because the screen provides prefabricated answers, man no longer learns to question his surroundings. Another effective tactic is social seclusion. Merleau and Hannah Arendt found that isolation was a major contributor to totalitarianism's success. A person is far more prone to hallucination when he is alone and denied the opportunity to engage in regular conversations with friends, family, and co-workers. Since not everyone falls for the ploys of the ruling class, he loses touch with the corrective force of positive examples. Propaganda-spotting individuals can assist in rescuing others from mental assaults. However, the impact of these uplifting examples is lessened if seclusion is enforced. The fact that humans, like many other species, are more likely to adapt to new thought and behavior patterns while isolated is another factor contributing to the success of mental death. Merleau bases this explanation on the conditioning research of physiologist Arendt Pavlov. Pavlov discovered that in a quiet lab, with few distracting stimuli, conditioned reflexes form more readily. Every animal trainer is aware that taming wild animals requires patient repetition of stimuli and seclusion. Totalitarians adhered to this guideline because they understood that keeping their political victims alone, isolated, bewildered, and under attack from waves of terror would help them become subdued more rapidly. People who are experiencing mental assault become vulnerable and despairing. An unending supply of propaganda transforms reasonable minds into a battlefield of illogical forces, with chaos roiling both inside and outside of them. As the masses long for a return to a more orderly environment, potential totalitarians have the opportunity to take decisive action. In a world that appears to be going quickly in the wrong direction, they provide a way out, a return to order. But there's a cost to this return. A ruling elite must gain control over all facets of the populace's lives and relinquish their freedom. They become dutiful and subservient subjects, giving up their capacity to be independent and take charge of their life. Stated differently, the general populace gives in to the delusions of totalitarian madness. Merleau portrays this fall in striking detail. A form of collective insanity can be seen in the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. In such systems, human morality and reason gradually or abruptly vanish. We are surrounded by a pervasive sense of fear and are projected with fictitious adversaries. As a result, the dominating powers urge society to turn against itself. The authoritarian world promises a pathological order. Totalitarianism eradicates the spontaneity that brings life's pleasures and the inventiveness that propels society forward by enforcing rigid uniformity and blind obedience from the populace. Stagnation, devastation, and mass mortality result from total control of such a system of governance, whether it is administered by scientists, physicians, legislators, bureaucrats, or a dictator. Tell me, is this content making you think? Don't forget to leave a like to support the channel. Now tell me, do you think we're experiencing signs of a collective psychosis at the moment? If so, what examples do you see around you? Leave your opinion in the comments. The topic of how to prevent tyranny is arguably the most significant one we currently confront. It is still possible to lessen the impacts of this mass psychosis if society has already entered the early phases. While we can never be sure of the outcome of collective insanity, there are things we can do to help discover a cure. However, this effort necessitates the collaboration of numerous individuals and a range of ways. The response must be as diverse as the mental attack. The first step for those of us who wish to contribute to the restoration of sanity in a crazy world is to organize our own thoughts and lead lives that encourage others to do the same. The fact that our time demands redemptive people who can break out from the grip of mass hysteria and preserve at least their own souls by being a ray of hope for others, is no coincidence. There are other actions that can be performed nevertheless, if one is not a victim of psychosis. First, as much information as possible should be shared that contradicts misinformation. Fiction and lies propagated by would-be totalitarians are defeated by the truth. Their capacity to restrict the free exchange of ideas is one of the factors that determines how successful they are. Using comedy and mockery to undermine the legitimacy of the ruling class is another strategy. We must learn to employ the weapon of mockery against rising dictators and demagogues, Merleau explained. The demagogue himself is nearly incapable of comedy of any type, and he will start to lose his mind if we make fun of him. The establishment of parallel institutions is a strategy advocated by Vaclav Havel, a political rebel under the Soviet Union's communist government who went on to become president of Czechoslovakia. Any kind of company, institution, technology, or creative endeavor that is ethically outside of a totalitarian society, yet physically located there, is considered a parallel structure. Havel noted that these parallel systems worked better than political action to thwart authoritarianism in communist Czechoslovakia. Furthermore, a second culture or parallel society emerges on its own when enough of these structures are established, serving as a haven of liberty and reason in the context of totalitarianism. Parallel structures are, if not places where another life can be lived, a life that is in line with its own aims and in turn constructed in harmony with those goals, as Havel argues in his book, The Power of the Powerless. These early attempts at societal self-organization reflect the endeavors of a segment of society to drastically depart from the totalitarian system and to liberate itself from the self-sustaining elements of totalitarianism. But more than anything else, action by as many people as possible is required to prevent a full-scale fall into totalitarianism's madness. An active and concerted effort is required to restore freedom to the world, just as the ruling class does not passively sit by and take intentional measures to expand their authority. In a society that gives in to the delusions of authoritarianism, this can be a very difficult task. However, tyranny, like hell, is difficult to overthrow, as Thomas Paine noted during another troubling period in history. We do have some comfort, though. The more challenging the battle, the more magnificent the triumph. It is crucial to keep in mind that the fight against totalitarianism involves psychological as well as political and physical challenges. The ruling class concentrates on these areas because they recognize how crucial it is to control the narrative and manipulate emotions. Recognizing our own psychological weaknesses and working to fortify our minds against manipulation are necessary to combat this. Education, including both formal and self-education, is one approach to do this. We need to learn to think critically, challenge authority, and become able to spot manipulation and propaganda when we see it. This entails being aware of logical fallacies, being able to verify information, and retaining a healthy degree of skepticism without being paranoid. Preserving our humanity and interpersonal relationships is another crucial element. Isolation and dehumanization are key components of totalitarian regimes. We oppose totalitarian thought by upholding truly human ties, exercising empathy, and refusing to view other people as enemies or abstractions. We also need to be on guard to safeguard our privacy and individual freedom. The population is easier for people in positions of authority to manage and keep an eye on as technology develops. Potential totalitarians may find it more difficult to maintain power if we are conscious of our digital habits, support privacy-preserving technologies, and reject the urge to compromise privacy for convenience. Supporting and defending freedom of the press and of expression is also crucial. When totalitarians take control, they frequently target these first. Upholding the freedom to free speech is crucial to preserving a free society, regardless of our opinions. Supporting alternative media and independent journalism that contradicts the government narrative is part of this. Furthermore, we must exercise caution while endorsing authoritarianism. It is rare for totalitarianism to emerge overnight. Usually, it comes gradually, with each little step lessening the outrageousness of the next. Even if an attack on our freedom is framed as beneficial to us, we must be prepared to draw a line in the sand and declare enough. It is important to note that culture and the arts are important in this conflict. Because they understand how inspiring and unifying art can be, totalitarian governments frequently want to censor and stifle creativity. We oppose totalitarianism by producing and promoting art that honors liberty, uniqueness, and human dignity. Even during difficult times, we may contribute to sustaining the torch of freedom. In conclusion, one of the most crucial conflicts of our day is the fight against the widespread insanity of tyranny. It is a war waged not just in the streets or in the halls of power, but also in the hearts and minds of all people. The end is never assured, and the journey is seldom simple. However, there remains hope as long as there are people who respect freedom, exercise critical thought, and remain human in the face of forces that dehumanize others. Making your entire existence an act of rebellion is the only way to deal with an unfree environment and achieve complete freedom, according to philosopher Albert Camus. Thus, let us commit ourselves to this liberation uprising. Let us serve as a ray of reason in a world that is becoming more and more crazy. As always, the decision rests with each of us. Know that this is just the beginning if this journey has made you wonder and wonder. Sharing, debating, and applying information to create a more conscious and united world is where its real worth resides. I therefore encourage you to carry on this discussion in the comments section, express your thoughts, and delve even deeper into these intriguing findings. If you've made it this far, it means that these reflections on how to resist totalitarianism and preserve our freedom have brought you important lessons. Now I'm asking you for a simple but powerful gesture. Like this video because it helps the channel grow and bring this knowledge to more people. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep following content that expands our consciousness. Together, we can keep the flame of critical thinking and freedom alive.